Patterns of Evidence, Exodus, a critique with Dr. David FALK. Yeah, what's going on, party people, the place to be? I go by the name of the BK Apologist, transmitting all the way live. New York is the city, Brooklyn is the borough. What's good? What's popping? It's Tuesday. Pretty good so far. I mean, the world is nuts, but you know, we're here, we're alive, we're breathing, and that's a good thing. Praise the Lord. Absolutely, absolutely. And with me today is making his third appearance.
Yeah,
I think now you're a three-peater. You know, that's you're my first three-peater actually.
Oh, am I?
Yes. It's kind of like Sinai Live. You know that they have the 5-time club, and so you're the first three-peater of my channel. So
you have an Egyptologist now, and you're not going to let him go.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I'm gonna take all your brain and just put it on my channel. You know. So of course, the brain in question that I'm talking about is Dr. David FALK. How you doing, sir?
I am doing excellent. How are you?
I am doing. I'm here, man. Just another day in paradise. You know.
Yep.
Lockdowns, transitions.
Oh yeah.
You know, the usual fare.
Mm-hmm.
You know. So for those who don't know who you are, sir, can you tell the people who you are and what you're about?
Okay. Well, I am an Egyptologist. I am a research associate at the Vancouver School of Theology. I hold 4 graduate degrees in Near Eastern disciplines. Did my PhD at the University of Liverpool in Egyptology. And I'm an evangelical Christian.
So in other words, he is a unicorn, people. You know, he's an Egyptologist who actually loves Jesus. So
I do.
It's a beautiful thing. And so, you know, we've talked about a few things about Egypt, and of course, you know, when you have someone of your caliber around, of course, the first question people are going to want to know is Exodus, right?
Exodus. Oh yes,
that's the first thing. I'm sure
questions about Exodus all the time, but then again, that's my specialization.
Right.
That's where I really sort of concentrated my studies, was on the Exodus and the Ark of the Covenant.
Cool. And by the way, he has a book. I was in the book again, sir.
The book is The Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian Context and Illustrated Journey.
Yes, I got my copy. I'm definitely enjoy it. He definitely tries to give you a crash course in ancient Egypt. Like you will, you know, when you leave the book, there's going to be sand on your shirt, and you know, it's very, you know, immersive, you know, experience with the book. He really tries to pull you into ancient Egypt. So I definitely appreciate that. So what we're going to do today is, well, what comes naturally for you, right? We're going to talk about the Exodus, but the way we're going to talk about it is we're going to talk about a very, very famous documentary, at least when it comes to Christendom at large. And it's the Patterns of Evidence, Exodus. And for a lot of the believers, you know, it was a godsend, to be quite honest with you. A lot of people who had their faith a little shaken by, you know, the biblical minimalists and atheists and, you know, the conscious community, you know, they really harp on the fact that the Exodus did not exist. So when this film came, it kind of reinvigorated people's belief in the Exodus, believe it or not. So, but
and it has excellent production values.
Absolutely.
Excellent production values.
But you know, I was perusing Mr. Falk's channel, and he has some contrarian views about the documentary.
Yes, I don't like it.
Huh? I'm trying to be charitable here. Yeah, he doesn't like it at all. But I definitely want to hear his side, since he is an expert in this field. And first off, if you could just talk about, you know, when you do critique this film, you know, for a lot of people, like I said, they really enjoy this film. So when you show points of contention, what's some of the blowback that you receive based on your critiques?
Okay. Well, the first thing I normally have to sort of deal with is a series of questions that come up or accusations.
Mhm.
One of the first accusations I get is that I haven't watched the films. Okay, that's probably the first thing.
Right. You want to get that?
I think I'll get that. That's the thermometer.
No problem. As you do that, I'll talk to the people in the chat. We got my man Built for Speed. Yeah, you definitely gotta wear your flip flops for this one. You gotta wear your chancletas, baby. You definitely gotta do that. We got my man CMB. We got JP Davis in the building. We got Thomas White, Adrian Jones, Carl Anthony. We got Exodus, Life Change. So Exodus, man, this is your thing. I mean, this is your namesake, right? So you should definitely enjoy this.
All right.
So he is back.
I apologize about that.
Not a problem.
The thermometer decided to malfunction right at this particular moment.
Of course.
Of course. Okay, so the first thing I have to deal with is, have I watched the films? And the answer is yes, I have watched all the films. I also have the books. So I have the Patterns of Evidence books. I have the books of the various figures that these films lionize.
Right.
Like I've got most David Rohl's books. I've got Douglas Petrovich's book. I've got Glenn Fritz's dissertation. So I am very well read on this. Now, the second question or accusation I often get is, well, if he doesn't believe the films, he must be an atheist.
Mm.
Okay. And I'm not an atheist. I'm not even close to an atheist. Then he must be some sort of biblical minimalist. He must not believe in an Exodus. Right. Yes, I believe in an Exodus. I believe in a literal Moses. I believe that the children of Israel exited Egypt and crossed through between the walls of water through the Sea of Reeds. That's what I believe. Okay. So then I finally get usually the argument by celebrity. Well, who's this guy to be criticizing such luminaries such as David Rohl or Douglas Petrovich? Well, in 2017, I was invited to a debate to debate both gentlemen at the same time. And that happened at Providence, Rhode Island. So that was kind of a furball of a debate, but I was the figure that they did invite to debate them, representing a more conventional view of, say, the Exodus.
All right. So you definitely had the credentials to have a 2-against-1? That doesn't seem to be too fair, David. I mean, they're ganging up on you. What's going on?
It wasn't a fair debate. I'll say that. The fix was in. The fix was in.
Is there any video of that debate?
There was an audio recording.
Wow.
It was an audio recording.
Cool.
Now they recorded the papers, but not the question and answer sessions.
Interesting. That sounds like that was by design.
Yeah.
We can't have the big guys look bad, right? So
nope.
Can't have no proof of that. So So before we get into the points of contention, right, that you have for the film, what do you think is the thing behind the film? Like, what do you feel like was the goal? Was there was it a pure motive? Do you feel like there's some kind of nefarious thing going on? Like, what's your take on the intent and purpose of the film?
Okay, the intent and the purpose of the film is to drive people to a belief in an early Exodus date where Amenhotep II is the king of the Exodus. Okay? Now, Tim Mahoney had made a pitch that in every film he says he's just a seeker. He's just a seeker. He's just trying to find the truth. That's all he's trying to do.
I don't think you believe him too tough, but go ahead.
It doesn't take much research to figure out that this is false. Okay. All you have to do is start looking at what the background of his writers and consultants are to find a pattern of evidence here that denies what he says.
See what you did there. Yeah.
And basically with one exception, and that exception that I did find basically has no beliefs at all, which is kind of strange and right there. But everybody else on his writing and consultant team holds one of two, no, I shouldn't say one or two, both of these beliefs. They believe in that early date of the Exodus. They also are American young earth creationists. Now, I don't have it in for creationists. I'm a creationist myself. Okay? I think that the criticism that I have of this is not that doesn't apply to, say, other forms of creationism, like, say, continental creation or other forms of young earth creationism. But what we have in the case of this combination of early Exodus date plus American young earth creationism is a hermeneutic, which is a way of interpreting the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
A way, and this view, it's called American biblical chronology, abandons the historical grammatical method that's been the predominant method of interpreting the Bible for the last 300 years. They've substituted that method with a method that was designed in the 20th century to say, hey, we can date historical events by tabulating genealogies and chronological dates in the Bible. Now, they pick and choose which dates they choose. They decide that are important, and that's a problem. That's an interpretive problem. But what they're going to do is they're going to try to get people moved towards, say, more esoteric views of, say, Bible and history.
You mean like Bible code stuff, like that kind of stuff? You mean?
No, no.
That's too extreme.
That's probably a little too extreme. But what they want is they want you to arrive at that early date of the Exodus view. Now, this brings up a very interesting question, is why then did they use David Rohl in their first film? Because David Rohl's an agnostic.
Right.
He doesn't believe in the Bible. But what David Rohl did was put skepticism upon conventional chronology. The one thing that supporters of the early Exodus date and American young earth creationists both hate is conventional chronology, because it doesn't play nice with a naive view of, say, American biblical chronology. Because you then have, say, the pyramids being built before the global flood.
Right.
Okay? And that's a problem for them. So what they want you to take away from the very first Patterns of Evidence film is a doubt of chronology, but without actually adopting any of David Rohl's specific views. And let me give you an example of this. For example, David Rohl redates his chronology by 300 years. But Patterns of Evidence extends that to 400 to fit their pattern. The result is we now have an ahistorical view of evidence. If you don't tie evidence to a date, you can arrange it any way you want. Makes it very convenient.
But it definitely seems like they were trying to tether events to certain dates. Like they have that nice little sliding thing, that wall.
Yes, but what they don't tell you is they dicker with the dates. Okay? For example, their dating of the Prophecy of Nefertiti or Ippaware, where it talks about all these disasters that fall upon Egypt.
Right.
Okay? The conventional date for that is the beginning of Dynasty 12. That's because the Pharaoh is actually named in some of those texts. That's Amenemhat the First. But they redate that to the middle of Dynasty 13.
Is it because the prophecy is too far or too far
early?
Back? It's too early.
Too early. So they've got to make it later to fit their pattern. It's confirmation bias. So they've cherry-picked the data and use confirmation bias to create this pattern, this fake pattern that they can then move to fit their ideology. It's a distortion of the data.
Okay. So, since most of us in the chat, including me, are laymen when it comes to this, when you speak of this, the standard chronology, like how does one go about crystallizing this particular chronology that you subscribe to?
Well, the modern chronology, the single tool that we love most as modern chronologists is the synchronism. Now, what is a synchronism? Well, let's say you send me an email and I print it up and I leave it on my desk and eventually it goes into a garbage heap somewhere. And 400 years from now, a archaeologist digs up that printed email. That archaeologist can tell that Alfredo and David lived at the same time because they're sending each other correspondence.
Right.
Okay? Now, the kings of the ancient world also sent each other letters. Hundreds and hundreds of letters.
Right, like the Amarna letters and stuff like that. Right.
The Amarna letters are a perfect example of this. But we have other letters. We've got treaties. We've got royal gifts with inscriptions on them. We've got dedication stela, marriage stela. Hundreds of documents that show that these kings, various kings, lived at roughly the same time. And this is why modern chronology can't move much in some respects, is because you have all these things locked in. Like, let me give you an example. Did you know that we can date, we have a date for Abraham?
An actual date.
An actual date. Because we have a synchronism for Abraham.
Okay, let's hear this real quick.
Genesis 14:1. We know that Abraham lived at the time of Amraphel of Shinar.
Mm-hmm.
Who is Amraphel of Shinar? Well, scholars agree across the board, Shinar is Babylon. That's not contested.
Okay.
So you've got left is Amraphel. You have 5 letters in that name. You have an Aleph, a M, an R, a P, and an L. Okay? We also have the complete kings list for Babylon. So we have almost all the kings. There might be some little minor kings.
Post and pre-flood, right? Or just pre-flood.
Well, let's say post-flood just for the sake of argument.
Okay.
Since we are dealing with the time of Abraham.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Okay. So all we have to do is say what kings of Babylon would possibly match Amraphel. Okay. Now, you can usually dispense with the last character because of the way Semitic languages works. It tends to change the last letter.
Right.
Okay, that's nothing unusual.
Mm-hmm.
But we have one king and only one king in Babylon that matches the guttural at the beginning, the MRP, and that's Hammurabi. In Babylonian, it's Amurapi. Perfect match. And the date of Hammurabi is well known because he sent lots of these letters to various kings. He sent letters to the kings of Larsa, to old Assyria. There's a connection with Mari. And there's even a connection with Egypt. And here's one of the issues we have now. We can connect because we have a synchronism for Abraham that connects Abraham to Hammurabi. Hammurabi is connected also then to Neferhotep the first in Egypt. We've got this sort of 18th century date for Abraham.
David, real quick, they're asking for the passage again. What was that passage you just quoted?
Genesis 14:1.
Right, Genesis 14:1, guys. So they are very attentive, sir. They're liking what you're saying. Yeah.
Okay, so now we've got a date when Abraham was alive, which is in the 18th century BC. Wow. So now you've got patterns of evidence films coming along basically saying Joseph arrived during the reign of Amenemhat III 80, 90 years before then, now we got a problem.
Wow. Okay.
Now we got a problem because we have Joseph arriving in Egypt before the death of Abraham.
Yeah, that's not going to work.
That's not going to work.
Wow. Okay.
But that's how modern chronology works, is it works on synchronisms.
Now, different kingdoms have different forms of recordation when it comes to the time of their king's reigns, right? Because the way I think the Israeli kings, they already counted from the birthday. They start the reign, even though he could have been king prior to his birthday, but they don't count until his birthday or something like that.
No, it works a little different in Israel. Because the calendar is roughly the reigns of kings is roughly based upon under what hegemony they were living under. Okay, so for some of the period of time in Israel, they're living under, say, Egyptian regnal years, and the way Egyptian regnal years work is you get credit for your first year, regardless. And then let's say you live 1 year into your second year, and you're dead. You get credit for 2 years, 2 full years, even though it's 1 year, 1 day. Okay. Now, with Assyrian dating, it's a little different because it is based on the turn of the year. So an Assyrian king, he comes to the throne at, say, after that one, that his predecessor lived 1 day in. For the next 360 odd days, he doesn't get credit for that as his first year. He's still living out the year of his predecessor. And then the following year, he now gets his first regnal year.
It's kind of like being president-elect. Like you've been right, but you're not president, but you are the elected. You're waiting for the transition. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So the count is a little different. So this is one of the reasons why, say, the dates that we find in, say, Assyria and Babylon are so accurate. And why there can be some, say, shift in years when it comes to, say, more of the Egyptian style of regnal counting.
Okay. All right. So now that we have that basis with Abraham. So where do we go from there? Like, how does that work?
Where do we go from there? Well, it does provide us with those sets of synchronisms do provide us with a very solid means to date, say, the Egyptian 13th dynasty. But it's not until, say, the 18th and 19th dynasty where we get a lot of these synchronisms. We get a lot of them at that point, and then those dates become very hard to shift. They're only off by maybe 5 years. So there's no moving these things hundreds of years. In the case of, say, for example, Ramses II, we have synchronisms with the Hittites, who have synchronisms with Ugarit and Mari and all these other Assyrian kingdoms. So because they become hard to move, Ramses II also becomes very hard to move.
Now, is that the Ramses of the Battle of Kadesh, or is that
Yes.
Ramses? That is Ramses II. Okay.
That is the Ramses of the, and we have for Ramses II, the Battle of Kadesh is won because that's been recorded, including the regnal year of when Ramses did it. We also have some correspondence. We have a marriage contract, and we have the peace treaty with the Hittites.
I've seen the peace treaty. Yes, I've seen that. Yeah.
And both those are dated.
All right. So with this chronology, when does Moses show up? Let's start with that.
Okay. Well, we don't know exactly when he shows up. Okay. So in all likelihood, the Exodus took place roughly around 1260, 1265 BC. That's where it roughly takes place.
And that's based on the syncretism with the
that's
correspondence.
Based on synchronisms. That's based upon, say, the death of Ramses II's firstborn son. We actually have that recorded. The death of his firstborn son. There's also the fact that it's also limited to how late it can go too by the Merneptah stela.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So the actual pharaoh, according to this chronology, the pharaoh of the Exodus is Ramses the Third, Ramses the Second.
Ramses the Second.
Okay.
He reigned 66 years. It was a very long, very eventful reign. Okay, a lot can happen in 66 years.
Right. As a segue to your book, I found since you're talking about the Ark of the Covenant, but I was looking at I'm a big fan of Michael Heiser, and he was talking about how with the Ark and the Tabernacle that it's most reminiscent of the war camp that Ramses had. It's very similar.
Yes, well, there is similarities between the war camp and the tabernacle.
Right.
Now, I don't get into that in the book because I'm looking more at the furniture aspect of it.
Right.
Yeah, the tabernacle.
But when he said that, I thought of you.
Yes.
Because I know you believe Ramses is the. So I'm like, well, that would make sense if Ramses is the pharaoh for them to use that model because they just left Kemet, right? So this is still fresh in their head. So when it's time for them to formulate this war camp, what's their reference point?
Yes.
Right. So yeah.
There is some similarity there, and as I say, I don't touch on that because I'm actually looking at the tabernacle as the combination of, say, the tent and the furniture.
Right.
So for me, that's more of that sort of shrine interaction. The war tent is a very interesting connection, but it isn't say directly applicable to, say, the Ark of the Covenant itself.
But it's very much a Egypt thing.
Oh, it's very much an Egypt thing.
Right.
Oh,
it's
absolutely.
not a Canaanite thing because there are those who say that they never really were there. They were in Canaan or this, but this kind of furniture, this ritual furniture, is very specific to the ancient Kemetic culture.
Oh yes, definitely.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. All right. So we have so Ramses is the pharaoh. So what were some other points of contention you had with the documentary outside of chronology?
Okay, the whole method that the films use, I think, is very problematic.
Okay.
Now, the way the films are done is you gather together an ensemble of legitimate scholars. You throw them all into a basket as skeptics, and then you lionize, say, somebody who's on the fringe of the academic discourse. Okay?
I.e. David Rohl?
David Rohl, Douglas Petrovich, Glenn Fritz, pick your choice. The issue then becomes, as the movies progress, you are presented with a series of binary choices. For example, you'll be presented with a choice of, say, skepticism versus belief. Or, say, naturalism versus miracles. Or an absence of evidence versus a pattern of evidence. Okay. All along the line, the audience is forced to make these black and white binary decisions. And the fact is, all of these are invalid choices. They're fallacious choices. They're not the only options. But it gets the audience into a pattern of thinking, of black and white thinking, us versus them thinking.
Right.
You believe in the movies or you're an atheist, which is why I have to answer that question every time, is because the people who have watched the films have become enculturated into this black and white thinking. And it's logically fallacious. It's sort of the opposite of what the production company suggests being thinking man films. It's not actually asking you to think. What it's asking you to do is just go with the program, go with the flow. So I think that kind of thinking is very, very dangerous because it doesn't open people to what is the truth, but what is the choice. Each one of those, say, dichotomies is, as I said, invalid. Even if we take the last one, absence of evidence versus a pattern of evidence. Well, an absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence.
Right.
It's nothing at all.
So it's
not
either
evidence for, it's not evidence against, it's nothing.
Right. Either you agree with our argument or you're going to hell.
Yeah, pretty much.
You're even. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's okay. I guess definitely see that.
The whole naturalism versus miracle thing. They use that in the third film.
Yeah.
That and the fact is that many of the people who believe in, say, an Egypt-side exodus aren't unbelievers. They actually believe in a literal crossing of a Red Sea. Okay, so it's a false choice.
Yeah, when I saw that last film, it was like I'll be honest, I did enjoy the Exodus one, but when they started doing the Red Sea, it felt different. Like I felt like they wasn't trying to be as well. Now after hearing you, they wasn't academic at all, but they gave a veneer of academia, right? On that film, they threw it out. Now it's like I felt like I was watching a TBN special. Like it was very like word of faith. It was really, really religious now. And
yes.
It was, I found it strange, but carry on. Yeah.
Well, they've got you. If you've made it to the third film, they don't have to pretend anymore. They've got you on the hook. You're already vested into the belief system. So they don't have to pretend at that point. And the fact is, they never believed that they were making a seeking kind of decision to begin with. Because if you look at, say, the credits on the first film, it's all people who have been, there from the beginning. Glenn Fritz was a consultant on the first film. Now he's starring in the third. So here's the issue is when you start distorting data, and by the third film, okay, we've not only made the data ahistorical, but we've also made it ageographical. So we've taken the data, torn it out of its time, torn it from its place, and now we have data without context. Distorting the data creates a lie. And any lie owes a debt to the future. Have we ever really recovered from the whole Galileo debacle? That was Ptolemaic astronomy. That was basically said, hey, this proves the Bible. But what happened was when Ptolemaic astronomy fell to Galileo, who ended up holding the bag? People blamed the Bible, not Ptolemaic astronomy. Long after Ptolemaic astronomy was dead and gone, people are still blaming the Bible for the belief that the sun revolved around the earth. Likewise, the patterns of evidence is creating through its distortions a debt.
So they're making it harder to defend.
Yes.
An actual Exodus.
Yes. We've already seen this. We've already seen this in Israel Finkelstein's book.
Yeah,
when Finkelstein says that there is no warrant for a biblical Exodus, he's referencing an early Exodus date and saying that's the biblical date. Few pages later, he makes the remarkable admission that if there were to be an Exodus, it'd have to be a late date. But he's already ascribed the biblical position as being that early date based upon the propaganda he's heard.
So he hasn't done his due diligence. He's just going by...
He hasn't done his due diligence, but you know what? We haven't done ours. We have a truth problem in the church.
Okay.
We like our ears tickled. We're not patient enough to search the scriptures properly and to evaluate the data in truth. And that is where this is all leading. And that's why I've been an outspoken critic of these movies.
Because that's interesting, because for you it's in a weird way you're kind of defending the gospel in a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you feel like they are actually hurting the defense of the truth and reality of these biblical events.
Yeah, they're making it 10 times harder to actually defend the Bible based upon real archaeological evidence.
Wow. So now, of course, the reason why they say they do what they do is because the date that you subscribe to, we can't find any evidence.
Again, that's an absence of evidence argument, even if it were true. Let me give you a great example of this. One of the things they've said is that we have to redate Jericho to the fall of Jericho to the 14th century or the 15th century BC, because we find no evidence of a late Bronze Age city on Jericho. Okay, it's another absence of evidence argument. So you get Bryant Wood in there, and he redates all the typology of the pottery to make it a 15th century date when Kathleen Kenyon says 16th. But okay, let's say that's true for example. Well, now we run into problems. So when we try to correlate that with, say, the destruction layer at Hatzor, where the destruction layers are really, really clear, and there was no destruction at Hatzor until the 13th century. Okay, now we got a real problem, because we got a 15th century destruction at Jericho and a 13th century at Hatzor, and both were claimed to have been destroyed by Joshua. Okay, one man over 2 centuries.
Right.
Okay, now we got a real biblical problem here.
Well, that goes back to your thing of syncretism.
Let me complete this, because here's the kicker. Just this year, a archaeologist named Nigro published his results of his excavations at Jericho, and he shows that the entire city had been rebuilt during the late Bronze Age. But it was built out of mud brick. Mud brick and erosion don't go well together. The whole late Bronze city had been eroded away, except for certain sections of the wall. So now we have real positive evidence that there was a 13th century destruction at Jericho and a 13th destruction layer at Hatzor. Both of those easily accomplishable in one lifetime. Now, there was other evidence at Jericho that if you had paid attention, you could have figured that out. But without the actual walls there, hard to say. But this is the problem with absence of evidence. All it takes is one turn of the shovel to make you look like an idiot.
Wow.
And this is why it's bad historical method. You never go by absence of evidence. You can go by, say, positive evidence. You can say, hey, we got evidence at this location, so let's go by that. But you can't go by absence of evidence.
Right.
And that's the problem with the patterns of evidence, is it's dependent upon an absence of evidence argument, ultimately. And frankly, when we as ancient historians, a lot of the evidence that we actually use is indirect evidence. It's evidence of culture. It's evidence of place names. It's because you're not going to dig up a city in Egypt and find a sign that says the Israelites were here.
Right.
They weren't called Israelites. They probably won't leave a sign. They probably won't write it in Hebrew. There's a lot of reasons why you're not going to find that sign there.
Mm-hmm.
But what we do find is a city of Semitics, the largest, say, city of Semite Asiatics, that abandoned the city in the early 19th dynasty. Okay?
Avaris, right?
Avaris. Mm-hmm. And unlike what David Rohl suggests, Avaris and Paramses are actually different cities. They're separated by 2 kilometers. David Rohl takes a lot of liberties in his reconstructions. Like you look at his reconstruction of, say, Avaris and Pi-Ramses, you see him putting Pi-Ramses actually underneath the foundation of the city of Pi-Ramses. Well, that's not true. That's in fact patently false. The 2 cities are separated by 2 kilometers. And Pi-Ramses was actually on an island year-round. So there's no way you're going to take the city of Avaris, which is on the southern bank, and move it under the island.
Right. There's another part that they make a big deal about in the movie about Shoshank and Shyshank, right?
Yeah.
Did they get that right at all?
No, that's totally wrong. Wow. No, that's based upon several fallacies or several distortions of the evidence that David Rohl does. Okay, now here's his argument for the biblical Sheshank not being Shoshank the first. Okay, the first thing he says is look at the name Sheshach, look at the name Shoshank. Shoshank has an N, Sheshach doesn't. All right, that's a fair point. I don't contest that. That's fair. It would be nice if Sheshach had an N in it, but okay. But then he uses a historical argument. He says that Rehoboam was an ally of Sheshach, but Sheshank I attacked cities in the northern kingdom of Israel. Therefore, he couldn't have been an ally. Therefore, he couldn't have been the biblical Sheshach. Now, that's an incredibly weak argument because there may be diplomatic reasons why he did that. Who knows? So David Rohl goes to a linguistic argument. David Rohl then says, hey, okay, well, let's look at, say, Ramses II, and his nickname. David Rohl says his nickname is Sisu. Okay. David Rohl then says that Sisu is, if we take that nickname, and take it into Hittite, which he claims is a Semitic language, Sisu becomes Shishu. Hebrew is also a Semitic language that does a, quote, similar conversion. And Shishu and Sheshach are so close, Jewish scribes only had to change the last letter for ideological purposes. That's his argument for then redating. So therefore, Sheshach is Ramses II, and the date of Ramses II has to move 300 years. Okay, that's his argument in a nutshell. The problem is he lies about several key facts about that whole construction. First of all, Ramses II's nickname is not Shishu or Sisu. It's Sesisu. This is a mistake a first-year student of hieroglyphs wouldn't make. There's 3 S's in the name. You can't get out of that. The second thing is that Hittite is not a Semitic language. Hittite is an Indo-European language. It's actually closer to Hindi and Greek than it is to Biblical Hebrew. Okay, so the fact is it's just not it's as relevant as Japanese. Okay, the reason why Hittite converts all S's to that sheen, that sh sound, is because the Hittite language doesn't have an S. It doesn't have a sibilant S. You can't say snake in Hittite. You would say it snake because it converts all S's to that sh sound. Now, Hebrew, on the other hand, has an S, a samic, and it has a sheen. It has both. And there's enough loanwords from Egyptian into Hebrew that we know that Hebrew faithfully transliterates Egyptian S's to Hebrew S's. Egyptian sheens to Hebrew sheens. It keeps the two straight. Also, the name Ramses is attested 5 times in the Pentateuch. If you don't find Ramses converted to that sheens, Well, you're not going to find Sisu or Sesisu also converted. It doesn't make any sense at all. Finally, there's a historical argument, which is that Ramses II, in his conquest annals at Karnak, actually attacks the city of Beit Shemesh. Okay? Beit Shemesh is in the northern kingdom. So if Shishonk I isn't Rehoboam's ally and can't be Shishak because he attacks the city in northern Israel, then neither can Ramses II, who also attacks cities in northern Israel. Okay? So by Roll's own standards, if Shishonk I isn't Shishak, then Ramses II isn't doubly so.
So this is not just him misspeaking. Like
No.
This is by this design. He's being deceitful.
He's being deceitful. He's got a good story. He's got a good story, and he tells it well. But it's still a story. The fact is, David Roll really isn't interested in the truth. He's interested in fame. He's interested in publicity. You know, I showed him at the debate. I showed him my list of synchronisms across the ancient Near East. He wouldn't even look at it. Just refused to look at it. Wasn't interested. Wasn't the slightest bit interested.
How long did that debate last?
That debate lasted 2 hours.
Wow.
Oh, I can go on for marathon sessions. I mean, this is just
this is what you do. This is what
This is what I do.
Right.
3 hours, no problem.
All right. So we talked about the chronology. We talked about Shoshank. What other points of contention did you have with the film?
Well, there's lots of them. There's really a lot of them. Like the statue of Joseph, the supposed statue of Joseph at
You're not a redhead?
He might be. But the fact is,
he's not a ginger. He's not a ginger.
Yeah, the dating of that tomb's all wrong. That the date of that tomb dates to the 12th, 13th dynasties. Okay, so at the very best, it's before the introduction of the chariot into Egypt. The chariot features prominently in the Joseph narrative. It's used twice. It's used when he rides beside Pharaoh. It's used when he goes to greet his brothers. He gets in his personal chariot and rides. Okay? Now, that's very, very difficult because the chariot is exceptionally well documented in Egypt. We know when it arrives. And it arrives during the Second Intermediate Period in the late 17th century. So if we have Joseph arriving in Dynasty 13th, which is, say, the 19th century, we've got an issue. Okay? So that tomb is way too early. Second of all, David Roll's characterizing that tomb as having to be the Israelites, because there were 12 tombs there and a palace with 12 columns. Sounds really good. Sounds really good. But there are 27 tombs in that garden cemetery, not 12.
Yeah, he didn't mention that part.
No, he didn't mention that. He also didn't mention that the part that column, that 12 columned palace was actually another tomb built on top of some of those other tombs.
That's not good.
So this isn't an organized palatial layout of a cemetery here. This is one grave built upon another grave in a higgledy-piggledy fashion.
Wow. So it wasn't his courtyard; it was a cemetery.
It was a cemetery.
Wow,
it was a cemetery.
It's not good for David Roll. Wow. Ooh.
And we're just in the first film here.
Next, you're gonna tell me there's no Santa Claus. Oh man.
I would never lie to you.
Woo. Okay, so Yeah, right. Everybody's like, "Wow, oh, this is bad." Yeah, yeah, Isaiah, it's crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah,
But that's what
it's
happens when you
bad.
talk to people that actually do this for a living. They kind of know what they're talking about. So, all right, let's continue. Let's continue with the dressing down of this film. What else? What else did you find problematic?
Well, we've covered the salient points of the first film. Okay. Now, the other two films aren't any better. Now, there's probably less to say about the second film than there is say about the third or say the final one. Now, the second film, the choice the viewer has to be is forced to make there is Hebrew the language that we find at the early alphabetic inscriptions at Serbit al-Qadam. Okay, that's sort of the gist here.
Right.
The fact is, no one denies that and while the film is trying to make out that people are denying that Moses would have written his thing in early alphabetic inscriptions, none of the scholars are really saying that, except for a handful of biblical minimalists. Okay, I think there's two that actually deny in that film that Moses could have had any language at all. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that is sort of the view of, say, a generation ago. But today, most scholars would say, yes, it is definitely feasible that Moses would have written in an alphabetic script.
The consensus is that Moses had the ability.
Yeah, Moses had the ability. The point of contention in that film, what should be the point of contention, it isn't, because the film sort of subverts that, is were the inscriptions at Serbit al-Qadam Hebrew?
Well, they say it's Phoenician, don't they? They don't say it's Hebrew.
They don't know what it is. The problem is that those inscriptions, everyone recognizes they're Semitic.
Right.
The identification of Semitic vocabulary is well known. But the problem is the difference between the various Semitic languages is very slight. I mean, for example, what you'd have, say, between, say, Moabite and, say, versus Hebrew is N's versus M's in some conjugations. It's a very slight difference, and a difference that's even unlikely to show up on, say, a really early inscription. Mm-hmm. Because the tendency of early writers is to more abbreviate the writing. Abbreviate the writing, but read it as if it was the fully fleshed out language. Like, for example, you don't find gemination in a lot of early writing. Gemination is when you have a duplication of a letter. Like vessel, the S in vessel. There's two S's in there. That's right, gemination. Right.
Okay.
It's not phonetic. Okay? So issues like that are not going to appear in those texts. So it's virtually impossible to tell if that's Hebrew, if that's Amorite, if it's Hurrian, if it's one of a dozen different Semitic languages. And frankly, Petrovich has not done his due diligence to prove that this is actually Hebrew. In a review by Aaron Wilson Wright, he points out that even the vocabulary that Doug says is Hebrew actually shows up in other languages like Aramaic. So it's not exclusively Hebrew. But here's where he wants to go with this, and this is why this issue is so important to him. Because if he can show that there were, say, Middle Kingdom inscriptions that were Hebrew and some early inscriptions that happen to have the names of people in the Bible, he can prove, or at least thinks he can prove, that there was an early Exodus date. In fact, if you read his book, what he does this really phenomenal feat of circular reasoning, which is he says that Sinai 375a contains the name Ahisamach. And because it contains the name Ahisamach, we can date this according to the Bible to a certain date. And then he says this is proof of an early Exodus date. So he dates the stela according to the Bible and then says it's proof of the early date of the Bible. By any estimation, that's circular reasoning.
Right.
Okay? But that's where he's trying to go with this. Is he's trying to pin an early Exodus date by finding the figures of the Bible in those texts. And even by his own admission, he has to sometimes violate the rules of standard Hebrew to do this. Now, if you're trying to prove these texts are Hebrew and you're violating the rules of Hebrew to do it, then you're not reading Hebrew.
Is he also an early creationist as well? Is that what he's vying for as well?
Oh yeah, he's an American young Earth creationist, and he's a early date supporter of the Amenhotep II bent.
Okay.
Okay, and actually, so is Glenn Fritz. He's also along the same lines.
Interesting. So so all right, so you've dismantled Roll. You've taken Petrovich to task. Who's next on your list here?
Glenn Fritz. He's next.
Oh, okay.
Okay. What Glenn Fritz wants to tell you is that the Israelites didn't cross at the Sea of Reeds in near Egypt, but closer to Israel at what's called the Gulf of Aqaba, the modern Red Sea, that body of water between the Sinai Peninsula and the Arabian Peninsula. And what he's done is he's plagiarized the view of Ron Wyatt.
Oh, that dude's a hack. Even I know that. Like that dude's.
That's what he's done is he's plagiarized the view of Ron Wyatt. Now, the film goes into things such as chariot wheels of the
When I saw that, I'm like, okay, now it's time to turn this off. When I saw that, I'm like, okay, we're done. We're done.
Okay.
Yeah.
The pictures that Ron Wyatt had produced of these chariot wheels were forgeries. Pure and simple.
Right.
They're forgeries
absolutely.
Of chariot wheels.
Absolutely.
No Egyptian chariot wheel ever looked like that. Even the claim that these chariots were covered in gold is fraudulent.
And for one, but he made all these discoveries that no one's did.
Oh, yeah.
You know, he found the Ark of the Covenant. He found like this guy's amazing if he could.
Noah's Ark.
Right, he found everything. You know. Whew.
But even the idea that the Egyptian standard Egyptian chariot was covered in gold, it's a fraudulent claim. It's not true. And that's the way, because this is because of the way the Egyptian military works. If you want to join the Egyptian military in ancient Kemet, what you had to do was you had to raise the money to buy all your own equipment.
Oh, wow.
The government didn't give you equipment. Your rank in the army was based upon your ability to purchase equipment. So if you wanted to be high up in the military in ancient Egypt, you had to fork out the money for a chariot.
Wow.
And those weren't cheap. Okay? But people did it because they wanted to ascend the ranks. So
that's how you got promoted? Wow.
That's how you got promoted. So your typical Egyptian chariot was not covered in gold because gold was controlled by the royalty.
Right.
Okay? The supply of gold was basically controlled by royalty. So the few examples we have of gold-covered chariots come from those people who are actually royal or were related somehow, received it as a gift from the king.
Right.
Okay. But your typical chariot wasn't covered in gold. It was just wood.
Right.
And the reason it was just wood was occasionally you had to repair this thing. It was a service vehicle. Like all service vehicles, it can break down.
Yeah, and I got a feeling wooden wheels in salt water for how many thousands of years? Yeah. Not gonna last too long.
Yeah.
Not gonna last too long. So,
but there's even more to say about this too, because what Glenn Fritz wants to do is he wants to say that the mountains beside the Sinai, that's Migdol. Migdol are actually the mountains, and that the people were crossing the sea at the Gulf of Aqaba. Of course, it's a mountain climb down and a mountain climb up. Can you imagine little old ladies with their their flocks of sheep doing a mountain climb down and up? That ain't happening. So, I mean, it's completely ridiculous. And plus, we have a lot of Egyptian evidence that tells us where these things were in relation to each other.
Now, why would they fudge that part? Like, how does that benefit their overarching argument?
It takes out the whole geography aspect of this, okay? So, the thing is, geography is also associated with time and as well as space, okay? If you've got, say, a city that was built, like for example, let's take Migdol, for example. It was originally built by King Seti I, who was the second king of Dynasty 19. Basically, Ramses II's father. Okay? If you now say, though, that Migdol isn't that fortress on the Road of Horus across the North Sinai, but instead put it in the mountains down below, claim it's the mountain range, then you can say, well, of course no one is responsible for building Migdol, so we can't time it.
I see what you're saying. Okay.
But if you say that there's a Migdol that was built by an Egyptian king,
so now you're forced to admit, right, okay,
yeah, because the Israelites, when they leave Egypt, they're between Baal-Zephon, Migdol,
right,
against Pi-Hahirot and the sea. They're boxed in.
Right.
They got a fortress to the north, they got desert to the east, and they got the sea to their backs. And again, what we see also in the film is with the claim that, the Greek geographers never mentioned the Sea of Reeds by Egypt. They never mention it. Well, of course they didn't mention it. By the time the Greek geographers had gotten around, the Plesiac branch had already dried out. But in the late Bronze Age, that was a massive, massive estuary. Covered hundreds of square miles. Hundreds of square miles. They talk about how in the movie how, if you have 2 million Israelites, that they would completely surround the lake. But it isn't just one lake, and these estuary was huge. As I said, covered hundreds of square miles easily. Because that was, at one point, the Plesiac branch was one of the major 3 branches of the Nile. And it poured off into an estuary, and frankly, we have records that basically say it retraces some of the Exodus path in the Egyptian text, like Papyrus Anastasi III. Talks about the Pa-Tufi, the reeds, the Suf, the Yam Suf, and it also the text also calls it the Pa-Yam. So the text calls it both the sea and the reeds. So we know that water was at least considered a yam by the Egyptians. Okay? So you have from there going to Pi-Hahirot. What in Egyptian would be the Perhut Heret. And that actually translates into the house of the estate of the Uraeus.
And the Uraeus is the snake thing, right?
Is the snake thing.
Right.
I personally think it's a watchtower. I think it's personally, say, a watchtower, an outpost. Okay? But it talks about, the produce of this region, the reeds, the fish, the whole, everything you find in an estuary. So it does live up to the tufi. And that tufi is suf in Hebrew. Okay. So Prophecy of Nefertiti 3 takes you on this voyage from the reeds, the Sea of Reeds, to Pi-Hahirot, to Pi-Ramses, the capital of Egypt. And that's a really important dynamic right there that's really often overlooked, is that during the reign of Ramses II, the capital is moved. He moves the capital from Thebes, 300 miles away from Avaris, to Pi-Ramses, right next door to Avaris. Think about what that does to the Exodus narrative. Now you've got the king of Egypt, who's in constant contact with the taskmasters, with the elders of Egypt, and with Moses.
That wasn't hard for Moses and Aaron to go and speak with.
Well, this is why Moses could. Moses was an adopted member of the royal family. That gives him one right, and only one right, which is an audience with the king. Okay, he's not a prince of Egypt.
Right.
He's not a prince because he's not the son of a king.
Right.
He's the son of a daughter of a king. Okay, that gives him one right, and only one right.
Wow.
Okay, that's why he can have an audience. But he has to be close enough to the king to have that audience. See, here's the problem with one of the problems with the early Exodus date is that during most of that time, the capital was at Thebes. Thebes is 300 miles away from the Delta.
Right.
Okay. During the night of the Passover, midnight hits, the firstborn are dead. Pharaoh sends a message to Moses saying, get out of town, take your people and split. That message arrives the same night.
Right. That's true.
That would be quite a feat if it was 300 miles away.
Right.
And we're not talking about a time when there was good roads. That's a river trip. And I've been on a boat on the Nile. I'll tell you, those things are slow. There's no motorboats back then.
Right. Absolutely. So, all right. So, does the movie talk about the amount of Israelites that leave? Do they mention that? They don't mention that. Right?
Yes, they mention. I believe they mentioned 2 million Israelites. I don't think it was 2 million. I think it was more along the lines of hundreds of thousands.
Okay.
And here's the reasoning: is the count of the Becca, the sort of the redemption tax. Okay, and it's still used in Jewish culture today. When someone is born, and they are circumcised, you're supposed to give the priest a redemption fee, a small token amount.
Right.
Well, that Becca is a half a shekel, and it was done by weight, and there was 600,000. Now, back in the times of ancient Israel, the Becca was applied to adults over the age of 20. Now, while the text does say Gibor, which usually is normally a male, okay, it's normally a male. I think in that particular context, I think we might see some shifting lexicography there. The meaning, I believe, the meaning has changed. Okay, to become males. But I think back when the Becca was done, because the Becca applies to men and women. It applies to men and women. So in that cultural context, you would almost have to imply that the Gibor there has to, in that particular case, apply to both. So you have 600,000 adults leaving Egypt at the time.
So they kept records of the Becca? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, they kept a record. I don't remember the exact biblical text here, but it's in, I believe, Exodus. where they take the Becca tax, and they actually say how many individuals as a result of the weight. And I think it's 604,000 something and 50.
Okay, I don't know. Okay.
Okay, so there is that calculation. So I think 2 million is way out of the bounds. Now, when we look at, say, the demographics of say Avaris, okay, the site is Montfort Beatock estimated that the population was between 20 and 50,000. Okay, so that's really pretty small for a city that's supposedly that major. Okay, but the actual size of the site is 250 hectares. It's actually a really big site. And if we look at, say, the population of a Semitic city like Lehun, where the demographics are well known, they had a population density of 800 persons per hectare. If you use and frankly, population density is one of those things that goes up in time. It doesn't go down usually. Okay, so Lehun being a Middle Kingdom city, we can estimate that, say, the population of Avaris was probably at least in the 200,000s. Now, when they leave, they're probably picking up people whole along the way.
Right.
Okay. Good. So they're probably picking up another 100,000 from Pithom. They're probably picking, say, another 50,000 or so from Sukkoth. So they're taking the Semitic road out. And there might have even been some people from Paramses that decided to join in with them. I think, though, we're definitely talking about a population, though, in the hundreds of thousands. Okay. Not the tens of thousands and not the millions.
Okay, cool. The location of Sinai, they also talked about that as well, correct?
Yes, well, the volcano hypothesis of Ron Wyatt just doesn't do anything for me.
Did they mention that? Did he mention that? Did they?
Yes, he did.
Oh my gosh.
I don't know if he mentioned he mentioned the volcano hypothesis in the film. I don't.
But not as a viable option. They just said some people.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Glenn Fritz is a lot more, let's say, cagey than Ron Wyatt was.
Right.
Okay.
He's a little bit more slicker with it. Right.
He knows what he knows what he can
get away
persuade
with.
People with. Yeah. Exactly. Okay. So what we have in the case of the volcano hypothesis is the idea that Ron Wyatt found a painting of a bull at that volcano. Well, okay, cattle worship was ubiquitous in the ancient Near East. You're going to find them anywhere.
Right.
You find the silver bull at Ashkelon. That's the famous little idol of a silver bull. That was at the time said, well, the golden calf was actually silver, but cattle worship was ubiquitous. It was everywhere.
Bes, right? They worship Bes, right?
Bes is a dwarf. A Hathor.
Hathor, that's right.
You had various sacred bulls like the Apis bull, the Nevis bull. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of them. The Serapeum has these massive black granite sarcophagi for these bulls to be mummified.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so bull worship, cattle worship was everywhere. And this is why the Israelites, say, at Mount Sinai, gravitate directly to the golden calf, because that's the default mode of worship. Hathor worship was the most popular form of worship in ancient Egypt. Bar none. There's nothing that even comes close to Hathor worship in Egypt. Even the royal cults never had the same following that Hathor had.
I mean, even surpassing Re?
Even surpassing Re.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Hathor was the religion par excellence in Egypt. That was what the average person worshipped. That's what people worshipped from, say, the poorest peasant all the way up to the king. Because
the romanticism of Kemet, it's always about Ra. And
yes.
Amun Ra and all that. That's what you constantly get bombarded with that guy. You never hear hard talk too much. Yeah.
I'm not surprised, but even Ra, it kind of falls in and out of favor at times.
Mm.
You know, in the Third Dynasty, it's not Amun-Re, it's Atum. It's
Atum, right?
Atum-Re.
Atum-Re, right.
Atum. Yeah, we got to keep Atum and the Aten separate. They're different.
2 different.
Okay. They're 2 different gods, and they're spelled differently.
Atum and Aten.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
In ancient Kemet, Atum is a creation god, and it's just spelled TM. Okay. The Aten, the solar disk god worshipped at Amarna, is ITN. Okay. So right. we sometimes in English slur the 2, but they are different, and they have different histories and they are different gods. But in the Third Dynasty, it was Atum-Re.
Okay. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Hey, I had my thermometer go off. You had a motorcycle. We're even.
So Sinai, right? So
yes.
We're on Sinai. So the volcano nonsense
is nonsense. Yes, the volcano thing is nonsense, and that's because the Gulf of Aqaba crossing is nonsense.
Yeah.
Okay. Now we don't know where the real Sinai was. Okay. Now we think it's near or St. Catherine's, but we're not sure. In all honesty, we're not sure. But we do know that they enter the Israelites follow after they cross the Red Sea. They go southwards. They go down to Mara and down past Sarabit Kadam. And take the Wadi Faran across, okay? And there's a lot of mountains in the middle of Sinai there, a lot of them. And it could conceivably
any of those
be
mountains could be the mountain, okay?
Yeah, any one of those could be the mountain. We're not sure. But then again, too, how do we, I mean, that's a huge area. To excavate that area would just be, oh my gosh, mind-bogglingly difficult.
Even with satellite, are we even allowed to do that? Or no, right? The government.
Oh yeah. We've got satellite photos, but that doesn't tell us all that much. You know, that doesn't tell. They were there for a year. They were already living a pastoral lifestyle.
Right. So there's not going to be no evidence left.
There's no evidence. There's no evidence. There's no leftovers. And frankly, the fact is that when people start wandering around, say, from place to place to place, they don't leave huge amounts of evidence.
Right.
Like even Bedouin sites. We find some Bedouin sites in the Sinai. But usually because of what they've done is they've done, stoneworks of chert, which is flint. They'll make flint tools over centuries. They come back to the same sites and make tools over and over again for centuries. And that accumulation of centuries, we can see some archaeological remains.
Right.
But for a population that's conceivably wandering for less than 40 years,
you're not going to find much.
Right. That's going to be really tough to find anything.
Okay. So, what are some major takeaways that we should get from what you're saying about this film? Like, what's the end result here? Like, what's the moral of the story?
Moral of the story is don't believe everything you're told. Essentially,
it's simple enough.
Keep an open mind. Know your Bibles. I cannot stress that enough. Know your Bible inside and out, upside down. Know it well. If you know the legitimate, you cannot be swayed by a counterfeit.
It's true.
The fact is, the biggest liabilities of these films are the fact that it actually contradicts places of the Bible. Like our synchronism with Amraphel of Shinar. Okay? That's going to come back and haunt them. The fact that the Bible mentions chariots in Genesis is going to come back and haunt them. The fact that these place names mentioned in the Bible are well established in history is going to come back and haunt them. And why is it going to come back and haunt them? Because they didn't go back to the Word of God.
Wow.
That's why it's going to come back and haunt them.
So that means if someone knows that and wants to use that information to shake someone's faith, they can. If you put your faith in what these guys put in the film.
Yeah.
Wow. So it's definitely more harm than good. Wow.
It's definitely more harm than good. It's the ends justifying the means mentality. It's if we kind of make the evidence all fit and bolsters people's faith, well, people will come to believe. That's a good thing, right? Until they discover the truth, or someone points it out to them in a very embarrassing way.
And then so much for their faith.
So much for their faith. They've done more damage than good.
Wow.
Because the ends never justifies the means. The means always have to justify themselves. And when you distort the evidence, you're, again, creating that debt for the future. And someone is going to pay that debt.
Right. The unpaid bills will come calling.
The unpaid bills will come calling in.
Wow. That's that. Yeah, like my man here said, yeah, that's very sobering. That's very sobering. So you heard it from Dr. Falk. Know your Bibles, people.
Know your Bibles.
I mean, definitely, I know we need to read devotionally, but also read with an analytical eye.
Critically. Read critically.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with this. There's nothing wrong with reading critically.
Absolutely.
We open our Bibles, and yes, we all read devotionally. I read devotionally too. But there comes a point when I have to read it critically as well, which means, and critically means we're using our higher mental faculties that God gave us.
Right.
To tap into what the Holy Spirit is telling us about the text. There's nothing wrong with that.
No,
because
absolutely.
then we can say, okay, hey, this part of the Bible actually coincides with reality. That's a good thing.
It's a very good thing.
Our faith is based in history. Our faith is based in reality. It's not an empty faith. It's not a blind faith. It is a faith that's based in fact, in history, and in place, in geography. It's one of the few holy texts that consults over 900 place names. It's a book that's grounded in time and space. It's here in the physical, real world with us. This is why, this is one of the reasons why an ahistorical, ageographical approach to the evidence is so damaging. Because it takes that Bible and tears it from its history, its place, and its context.
Wow. Yeah, you're preaching now. Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. It's very convicting. Before we wrap things up, if anybody in the chat would like to ask a quick question to the good doctor pertaining to the Exodus, feel free. And while we're waiting for some questions, there's this rock that they like to show. And you know where I'm going, right? So it's like it has to split. That's supposed to be the rock that Moses tapped, right? Like that's How do you think?
Is this like the pillars of salt at Sodom and Gomorrah?
yeah. It's one of those things. Is that a Wyatt thing too? That rock?
Yep, that rock is a Wyatt thing also.
But at least with the rock, it's like it's there. It's actually there, and it's like, well, it does look weird, and
there's a lot of rocks there that look weird.
That's the closest he gets to any kind of grounding for one of his theories. It's like it is there, and there is a split in the middle.
But there's no spring.
The spring came. What ain't that the miracle, right?
Yeah, a spring where there shouldn't be a spring. That would be a miracle.
All right, here's a question here. How would you interpret the plagues and the death of the firstborn?
Okay. I don't agree with the idea that the plagues were a polemic against the gods of Egypt. Okay. I know that's a very common interpretation.
Okay.
But I don't agree with it. What I think the plagues are is God tapping into the Egyptians' own context,
right,
to pull out the things that they were afraid of.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. One of the things that they were very, very afraid of was that the Asiatic Semitics would rise up against them, that they would bring calamity upon them. Okay, they were really, really afraid of this. The fact is that the plagues, you look at like the blood, and the blood is completely misunderstood anyway. It's not a red blood; it's a black oozing oil tar kind of thing. Okay, we think of blood as being the bright red color. That's not what the ancient people thought of when they thought of blood. They thought of like blood being spilled on the ground in a battlefield. So when you look at, say, the Prophecies of Ipa, where it talks about the water turning into blood, one of the interesting things about that text really overlooked is the fact that people still drank from the Nile, when in normal circumstances, people didn't drink from the Nile. People drank from wells. People drank beer.
Right.
One of the interesting things about the Exodus is now they're forced to drink from the Nile because all the water in the vessels became contaminated as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's tapping into the Egyptian fears that they had in their own context. The whole light being snuffed out. The whole hail, the destruction, and frankly, the destruction of the barley was really a catastrophe. It was really a catastrophe. In many ways, it was more a catastrophe than it wasn't a starvation thing. One of the things we don't understand about the destruction of the barley crop was that Egyptians, only the poorest, very poorest Egyptians ate barley. Your typical Egyptian didn't eat barley. They grew barley to make beer, to purify the water.
Mm.
They noticed the Egyptians noticed very early on that people who drank from the river got sick, were more sickly than people that drank from wells. But that people who drank beer were more healthy than the people who drank from wells. So the destruction of the barley crop was catastrophic, because now your primary source of water purification is gone.
Mm.
That's a bad thing, especially when you have the water turning the blood. Okay?
Cool.
Now, also the death of the firstborn was not a challenge to, say, the gods, except maybe Pharaoh himself. But what it did was it just created incredible upheaval in the society. One of the things people don't realize about the death of the firstborn, especially the death of the firstborn of Pharaoh, was he wasn't a young child. He was 25. We know his name. His name was Amenhotep. He was the chief diplomat of Egypt. Amenhotep arranged the treaty between Ramses and the Hittites. He was the crown prince. He was the chief diplomat. He was next in line for the throne. He was, in his lifetime, really, really important. So what you had when the death of the firstborn is Amenhotep dying, one of the two viziers of Egypt dying at roughly the same time. We're not sure about the exact dates, but pretty much the same year. That's the equivalent of losing your prime minister and your crown prince in the same time. You had a complete upheaval of government because of the death of the firstborn. Threw the whole system into chaos. So, I mean, it was a really traumatic thing.
Hmm. Wow. Thank you. Wow, that's deep. I don't know if anybody else has any more questions, but Doctor, what do you have anything that you have planned on the? I mean, we could do about so much because a lot of us are locked down now. But any like virtual book tours, anything that any classes that you might be teaching that we should be aware of, any lectures?
Right now I'm doing a lot of writing. Actually, I'm doing a article for the Lexham Geographic Commentary on the role that Egypt played during the time of the prophets. Because Egypt continues to be an important influence even into the time of the prophets and through to the New Testament, actually. So I'm covering what happens during, say, the Israelites' interaction with Egypt at the time when Babylon conquers the kingdom of Judah.
Cool. How about any future books?
Future books, still pondering that question. I only just got my book last week.
You're kidding?
You got your book. You got your book before I did.
I've had my book like 2-3 weeks ago.
I know.
That's deep. Oh man.
I mean, I live in Canada. I mean, Canada Post is awful. I mean, I've received books long after they got them in Egypt. I mean, it just Africa gets books before I do. I mean,
wow. CNB says, I think when we read the Exodus narrative in scripture, it's almost like we're seeing the Ten Commandments movie with Yul Brynner in our heads. Yul Brynner did an amazing job, by the way. I love Yul Brynner as Pharaoh. I really do. He hammed it up so well. It was great. It was great.
He was actually very good as Pharaoh. I will admit that. He played a very excellent Pharaoh.
Did you ever see
But we do actually Disneyfy a lot of what we perceive of the Exodus. A lot of our theology is determined by the movies. One of the things that comes in the last Patterns of Evidence film is the idea that, it can't be Egypt because it's not deep enough. It's not big enough. Well, where does that come from? That doesn't come from the text. It doesn't come from the Bible.
Right.
That comes from Hollywood. Our theology is more now guided by Hollywood than it is by the Bible.
That's true. What's your thoughts on Prince of Egypt?
My thoughts on Prince of Egypt is, here
we go. Here we go.
It's not very historically accurate.
Well, I mean, yeah. Okay. Between Patterns of Evidence and Prince of Egypt, what's more accurate?
I think this is one of those false choices.
Did you ever see? Speaking of the original, this Cecil B. DeMille, did you ever see the long version of this movie?
No, honestly, I've never seen the Cecil DeMille Exodus. Believe it or not.
You've never seen the Ten Commandments?
No, I haven't.
Oh my gosh, it's fun. You gotta watch it. But there's a version where, because there's one they cut this part where before the movie even begins, Cecil DeMille comes out to the audience, and he basically does a devotional about the Exodus. The director, does this this little breakdown. I'm like, oh wow, really? Like they were preaching. He was straight preaching. I'm like, really?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Well, I have to. From what I understand, Cecil DeMille was very, very much a believer in the biblical text.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I was shocked when I saw that. I'm like,
he does try his best, I think, to do it, even though I haven't seen it myself. In all honesty.
Right.
Okay. And I know Tim Mahoney is very much influenced by Cecil DeMille. He talks about it frequently in the films. But I actually haven't seen it
classic.
myself.
I mean, even the special effects, how they did things for their time was super advanced. And it's definitely an epic. I mean, the soundtrack is amazing. Yul Brynner, amazing Pharaoh. Like it's fun. It's definitely fun. I highly recommend you watching it one day.
I've seen Exodus, Gods, and Kings, and it's terrible.
See, that's trash. That was terrible. That was so bad.
Ramses II is dressed up like a cross-dresser. he's wearing the Queen's crown.
Oh, he's wearing the wrong crown?
He's wearing the wrong crown. He's wearing the crown of the queen. That vulture headdress, that's the queen's crown.
You would think they would have actual like Egyptologists on standby, right?
Did.
They did.
They just ignored him.
Wow. That was horrible. And Noah. I think the same guy who did that did Noah.
Noah was bad too.
Trash.
Noah was
Trash.
really, really bad.
Trash.
Which one of them Noah was really bad? They're both bad.
There's the one with this guy, the guy who played Russell Crowe. That one.
Oh, okay, the later one. Yes,
they try to incorporate the Nephilim.
That was a great film. That was a great film. It was the Lord of the Rings. It was the Lord of the Rings. The Nephilim, that's the treants.
Right.
It's exactly the plot of the Lord of the Rings.
It was Ridley Scott. Okay, my bad. Ridley Scott was the one who directed that one. Noah, yeah. It was bad. It was the Lord of the Rings. You had Gandalf. That was Lamech. You had hobbits. Oh, man.
That's all you needed was the hobbits, and you had Lord of the
Rings. Oh man. Now that was a great movie. That was a great trilogy. Lord of the Rings was amazing. But
it was a my view on the Lord of the Rings was it was started off really good, ended poorly. Here's the reason it ended poorly, is because Peter Jackson did not understand what the movie was about, what the ring was. Peter Jackson thought the ring was evil. It's not evil. It's sin. Unless you view the ring as sin, you completely fail to understand the movie, what motivates the character's actions. This is why when say some powerful people can avoid picking up the ring. It doesn't call out to them. Like Faramir. Faramir says, if I saw that thing lying on the side of the ground, I wouldn't pick it up.
Wow.
But Peter Jackson has to change that dialogue because he doesn't understand the ring.
Either that or it's too overtly or it's overtly scriptural, and we can't have that. So
I think from the interviews, it's very clear that Jackson just didn't understand the theology behind the movie. And that happens often when we have these Hollywoodizations, is we don't understand the theology of these classics.
Right. Or the fact that there is a theology behind it. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, when my wife and I, we went and saw the movie, what was it now? C.S. Lewis movie.
Narnia?
Yeah, Narnia.
The
first Narnia film. And we left the theater, and there was these two teenage girls and going, I don't get it. I didn't understand that film at all. I just don't get it.
Wow.
Because they don't understand the theology. They didn't understand the background material.
Right. But that circles back into our Bible, right? If you don't know the backstory, a bunch of people leave reading the Bible. I don't get that. How do you get that?
Well, I was told this great true story. Didn't happen to me. It happened to D.A. Carson. Okay, but he would say this. He'd say this story in class to show us how context matters. When Carson was young, he was a part of a missionary, an evangelism movement on campus. And he was in the science faculty as an undergrad, and he gave the Bible to one of his friends. And 2 weeks later, he came back and asked his friend, how'd you like the Bible, reading the Bible? He goes, well, I didn't understand most of it, but I really liked the science fiction at the end. Okay, he was trying to relate the Bible to what he knew in his context.
Right.
We do a really, really poor job of this. We do a really, really poor job of relating the Bible and its context to our context.
That's true. No,
And
I always
this,
tell
again,
people.
exacerbates the truth problem.
Sure.
We then fall back on private interpretations, docetic interpretations, where it just means something to us and no one else. And that's what happens when we have a Bible without context. And patterns of evidence without context.
No, that's true. I mean, I always tell people on this channel that there are obstacles in knowing the Bible, because there's obstacles understanding any historical document, right? Because it was written in language that you might not be able to read, by people you've never met, from a place that you might not have been, and even if you've been there, you wasn't there during that time.
Well, right? Descartes, in his philosophy, one of his opening lines was, "I was dressed in a nightgown, waiting by the candle in the fire." Well, no one dresses in a nightgown today. Back then, in the 17th century, everyone did.
Right.
But today, it's something that has to be explained.
Right. He'll sound like a weirdo right now. It's like nightgown.
Yeah, he sound like a weirdo now. Yeah, exactly.
Right. That's true. Oh man, this is good stuff, man. Thank you so much for the breakdown. I think we got
My
so
pleasure.
much. Definitely will be, you'll be a 4-timer if you allow me. Yeah.
It would be my pleasure.
I'm thinking, well, maybe even before Passover, but definitely Passover, I'm going to have you come back and take a deep dive and just drill down on that alone and just look at the Egyptian context, which might break a lot of people's hearts, because
he is the truth, and the truth will set us free.
Amen. And with that, Dr. David Falk and BK Apologist will be signing off. Peace.
Thank you for having me.